I'm Emily Liggett. I am a technology CEO and board member, and I'm a member of the Northern California NACD organization. I have the pleasure today of talking with Harry Broadman about issues that are top of mind and we read a lot about in the headlines that are important to executive teams and boardrooms as we think about the geopolitics, global economy, and how it affects many of the other issues of our day, including sustainability, environmental, social, and governance. So, Harry, you're a seasoned business practitioner, economist, a board director, an investor, a trade negotiator, and a former White House official. So you've got a lot of experience. It's going to be helpful for us to talk about these topics. You're also a professor and a Forbes columnist that's focused on critical issues of the day in the global economy. So we'd like to tap into that deep expertise that also includes sustainability, innovation, and corporate governance, especially in emerging markets such as China and Russia, which you're also very familiar with. So with that in mind, and all the experience and perspective you bring, in light of today's challenges, what do you see that's emerging as critical business issues that ought to be front and center for executive teams and boards?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Emily, for inviting me to do this. I'm flattered and honored to spend time with you. Let me give four examples sort of that we're all seeing in the newspapers these days to, I think, illustrate what are contemporary intersection issues between ESG and the world economy or geopolitics. So one that's very front page news is the voluntary withdrawal of from Russia by U.S. corporates and other corporates, but certainly U.S. corporates. That's an intersection that I would call sort of the S and the G. But what's notable is these have been voluntary. The other example is also pertains to the governance and the social side, is what's going on in China and supply chains with respect to Xinjiang province and the Uyghurs. And rather than voluntary, there's a law by the U.S. and other countries also have laws. And these are very interesting because, why firms felt the need to do Russia voluntarily, why they did not in the case of China, I don't pretend to have an answer there. But what's interesting is these two cases where people might not think of them as the intersection of ESG and the world economy, but to me, they're very obvious examples. In thinking about on the E side of ESG, one topic that is near and dear to my heart as a former negotiator of transportation and trade in the world economy is what's going on with supply chains now. And what we know is that there has been a lot of congestion, particularly with respect to ships. And so we have pictures off of Long Beach, off of the Los Angeles ports, but also now it's migrated to the East Coast. It's migrated up to Oakland, and again, why would that be an ESG issue? Well, they're burning a lot of fuel, waiting to get into the port. The trucks are waiting as well. There's lots of empty containers piled up at these ports. So really, there's an environmental angle to this that I think most people really do not think about, but to me, it's front and center. And the other example, I think, on the E side is what China has been doing, frankly, far better than we have, is engaging in international trade with alternative energy technologies. Now, we're beginning to get there. I mean, as many of us know, we've just signed into law a CHIPS Act, at least on the semiconductor side, but I think when you read stories, the thesis that comes out is that China has really leapfrogged most of the advanced countries in this area. So they obviously have a serious environmental problem in their country, which is in part motivating them, but they're also great competitors.
Okay, it's interesting you bring up the CHIPS Act because that is also something that's a bit geopolitical as well.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, so those are pretty interesting examples, and I'm sure all of our executives and board members listening can relate to all or some of those.
Yeah.
Right. So, if we think about making that more operational, that you've brought up those examples. So how might boards of directors and executives think about and act on things like this? What do you see happening as they think about all the short-term objectives that they have, as well as balancing with the long-term needs of the business?
Yeah, so let's look at the Russia example. I think it's fascinating. When I saw firms voluntarily leaving, I spoke with a couple of CEOs and board directors, and I said, so have you guys thought about the case in Russia and many emerging markets that people have long-term memories? And have you, in essence, conducted a net present value calculation about whether exiting now means you might be foregoing the opportunity to come back in? And as we know, as a thousand plus firms have left. Some of them have not left wholly. They're doing the minimum under Russia law to sort of have a shell. Others who have left have seen their intellectual property. So my point is, how are boards, how are the C-suites thinking about these and making, frankly, robust calculations rather than saying, oh my God, there's a war in Russia, we need to leave, without thinking through the consequences. I'm not suggesting that they've made the wrong decision. I'm just saying, these are businesses, and you got to think about these things, in a robust, rigorous kind of way. Going back, frankly, also to the CHIPS Act, to me, on the supply chain issue and the China trade technology issue, Washington has tipped its hand, and it's very different from when I worked in Capitol Hill with John Glenn, where it was largely a Democratic initiative to try to ramp up investment in technology by the government. Here, this is bipartisan, it's across the board. And that means the game has really changed. And so, I hope boards and C-suites outside those sectors that are directly affected by the CHIPS Act are watching this, because to me, it's a tidal change from a policy perspective, from a legal perspective. And I think also, what is paramount to me is what these examples mean, and there are many others, is the implication is ESG is not, I think, a fad, and it's not unembodied or disembodied from corporate operations. And so I think the firms that are going to be most successful will integrate ESG into their operations. And what I like to think, and I've done a Forbes column on this, is what's the role of the chief sustainability officer? And I said he or she really should be thought of as the chief integration officer, and he or she should be sitting next to the CEO. If we're really serious about this, rather than, years ago, ESG types of issues were sitting off in foundations or lateral to the core operations of the firm. Frankly, not enough of them, in my view, are integral to the firm. But I think we're moving in that direction. And I think boards and management teams need to recognize, I believe, that this is a trend. And the last thing I'll say is that, most C-suites and boards right now sort of think about ESG as well. That's for the audit side of the house. Yeah, the chief sustainability officer will be involved, but in order for us to gauge how well we're doing, particularly through disclosures, is we'll conduct audits. Well, to me, that's really the wrong end of the telescope, because audits are backward looking. It's not a disparaging comment, as they're looking under the law, right? What happened in the last year and reporting on it. Whereas ESG reporting is forward looking. It's not just what have you done last year, but what are your plans? And it's not just what are your plans in terms of you're going to hire more minorities. It's how are your factories structured differently? How is your supply chain structured differently? So I think that's where we should be heading. And there's rightfully a lot of emphasis on ESG disclosure. That's where we are. And frankly, there's not a systematic way of doing that, because there are all different kinds of standards. And one of the things that I've gotten involved in, I chair a new entity called the ESG Exchange, and what we're doing is putting together rigorous how-to playbooks about how firms should be disclosing. But even that disclosure is far removed, perhaps, but it's not a substitute for integrating ESG into operations. So I think that's the central message I believe that C-suites and boards should take away from at least this part of the discussion.
Mm-hmm. You know, to push back on that a little bit, Harry, when I think about all of the things facing these C-suites and boardrooms, you know, from running the day-to-day business, you know, from M&A activities, you know, just all the challenges when you add on top things like pandemics, cybersecurity, emerging markets, these geopolitical climates. I just, you know, I think it's difficult to know how to prioritize things. And when you think about skills on the leadership teams and in the boardrooms on so many areas, I mean, how do you think proactively about these challenges and governance practices, you know, in a reasonable way?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think part of the answer, I think we should look into ourselves as to not just the systems that we're using to have board meetings and the relationship with the C-suite and other managers, but what kind of skills do we have on the board? And you know, the question is, we've been talking about emerging markets, for instance, and the intersection between ESG and emerging markets and the world economy. And you know, it's one thing to have these kinds of conversations. It's quite another to have them, what I would say are more organic, ongoing within the board meetings. And as we know, most of the real board work is done, at least in the boards on which I sit, is in between the meetings. And so, you know, it raises the issue of what kind of expertise do we have on boards? And you know, in my view, sort of diversification means not just from a social angle, from a vintage angle about how old board directors are, but you know, who has expertise in certain kinds of things. So clearly there's been a movement, little by little, of having people with cyber expertise. And you know, boards are going to increasingly form cyber committees, and even some of them are forming sustainability committees. But the question is, you know, do we have the right talent, you know, on boards to think about these issues, not just as outsiders? You know, you might convene advisory committees, or you bring in specialists, which I do for NACD, and being hired by boards to guide them through some of these issues. But actually, and this is on some of the boards I sit, my expertise in emerging markets, and I did done some work about, you know, how do US boards compare with European boards in terms of expertise and living experience, working experience in emerging markets. And it's striking. It was another column I published in Forbes, and it's quite striking how US boards really lag behind their competitors overseas. And so rather than having, you know, specialized conversations like this, if we really believe that these issues, the ESG issues, the global economic issues, are, you know, part and parcel of the fabric of the global economy today and for the future, they should be done organically within the board. And so that's part of my response, I think, to this. And I think it's time that we think about board composition in that way. Again, independent from and complementary to other questions about diversifications on the composition of the board.
Right. And so you mentioned the idea of having advisory boards, or some consultants or advisors to the board. So how would a board think about those? What items would you need someone on the board with cyber or sustainability experience or emerging market experience? And when is it adequately or better done with advisors, an advisor or advisory group?
You know, some boards, I know some companies have them. I think the issue is, again, I think it depends on one's view about how much these issues should be part of the day-to-day conversations among board members and the C-suite, rather than reserved for, okay, let's, you know, spend an hour from a regular board meeting to talk about issues. Let's bring in 5 geopolitical experts to talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
So many board decisions, so many operational decisions, at least on the boards in which I sit and the companies that I advise, these issues that we've been talking about are top of mind. Supply chain
Mm-hmm.
issues, right? I mean, these are not just,
Mm-hmm.
you know, fly in the pan issues. They are central to the function of the company. And so, yes, I think having advisory committees can be very helpful, or bringing in specialists from time to time. But in my view, frankly, that's second best. And I think, you know, doing a
Mm-hmm.
scrub of looking at, and I know boards do this, headhunters do this with boards all the time, looking at, you know, what kind of knowledge do we have on the boards? Not just, do we have, you know, lots of ex-CEOs, which is great, you need them. Do we have ex-CFOs? Yes, we need them. But we need, you know, there's only so many people that can sit around the table. And I think it's almost like a linear programming exercise to figure out and give weight to these different kinds of skill sets. So I think bringing in, you know, advisory committee is great, but I think it's a second, frankly, I think it's a second best solution.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. So before we wrap up, are there any additional, comments or thoughts you have on this topic?
So I think one topic that has come out of my role in the ESG exchange is, and some of my writing is, ESG still is sort of a bad word, as we know. It's changing, but more importantly, from a corporate perspective, it's seen as a risk. And so the question is, you know, this disclosure exercise is in part showing how companies are de-risking, but it's also an exercise, and I think not enough corporate boards understand this or, you know, have digested it, that ESG is actually a growth opportunity. And so the things that we've been talking about, Emily, supply chain changes, getting involved in advanced technologies and energy saving sectors, these are growth opportunities. It's not just de-risking. And so it's not just playing defense, it's playing offense. And I think, you know, the sooner that we can get to that point of thinking about ESG as a growth opportunity and not just something, oh yeah, we need to fill out this column and we've de-risked. I don't think, frankly, the firms with whom we compete, both in emerging markets and other advanced countries, think about it that way. And I think we really ought to change that optic in the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think you've encouraged us all to think about these more as an opportunity than as a risk.
Yeah.
And we will look forward to seeing you in Forbes or at the ESG exchange. And I want to thank you for the time and the thoughtfulness that you've given us some challenging things to think about and bring back to our C-suites and boardrooms. So thank you.
My pleasure, Emily. Thank you so much for the time.